Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Creation Myths. So today we're going to go in depth into this video right here. We're going to review this live stream. This was shown on Rebekah, that's right there, Rebekah, on her Examining Origins channel on November 22nd, 2025. And in this stream, she hosted, as you can see, Dr. Cornelius Hunter right there for a 2-hour conversation. They covered a couple of different topics in this stream, but one of those was virus evolution, and that happens to be like my specific field. That's what I worked on in graduate school, was virus evolution. So that's the part I'm going to cover here. We're going to do this as kind of like a live response kind of thing, like you might do live, but we're going to record it so that I can edit it and I can put in, like if I want to put in graphics or anything that I want to show while we're talking about this stuff, I can do that. So, but it's going to be that kind of live response format. So a few notes before we get going here. First, we're not going to cover every minute of this stream. It was 2 hours long. So we just don't have time to do the whole thing. And even if we just did the virus stuff, we'd be here for hours. So instead, I'm going to pull out some specific moments and some specific claims that Dr. Hunter makes and explain why they're wrong. And I'm also going to point out some instances of what I think is pretty egregious strawmanning of the evolution position and the basis for evolutionary theory that he presents. He's really not doing a good job accurately representing the position of the people he disagrees with, and I'm going to point that out in a couple of places here. I also, kind of along those lines, don't want to let Rebekah off the hook here. I and others are, I think, reluctantly coming to the conclusion that she's not a good faith actor in these conversations, in terms of honestly accepting facts that she is presented with, honestly evaluating evidence in an objective way, and specifically here, repeatedly hosting Dr. Hunter, and then he propagates misinformation that should be obvious as such, to anyone familiar with the topics, which, again, I would expect Rebekah to be familiar with the topics at this point, given the hours and hours and hours she has dedicated to it. So I think having multiple streams with Dr. Hunter, as I record this was just the most recent of maybe a half dozen or so at this point, repeatedly hosting him to just put what is absolute nonsense out there is indicative of the approach that she's taking. And I'm starting to notice that and point it out, and I'm not the only one. Among the things I'm going to cut out here, it's a bunch of what I found to be just like condescending remarks directed at questions or commenters in the live chat during the stream, and also at, evolutionists as a whole. And these comments amounted to basically, you don't understand your own theory, you're so blinded, you can't see that evolution is actually based on religious thinking or theological thinking. Stuff like that. That's the idea that he presents several times during this stream. I point this out because something else that he does, and he's done this in the stream and elsewhere, is that he has repeatedly warned me, and I believe other people who agree with me and disagree with him, basically says, careful with the claims you're making, you don't want to harm your good name. And I bring this up because I would like to suggest to Dr. Hunter that he take stock of what he is putting out into the world, lest he harm his good name, because, as we will see, he is promulgating some very obvious misinformation here. Now, the last thing I'll say before we get into this is we're not going to do these clips entirely in order. There's a few that I'm going to pluck that I'm going to show up front, and those are going to help us kind of frame the rest of the conversation. So what we're going to do here is start with just a short clip of basically how does Dr. Hunter describe himself as he approaches this conversation. So it's actually going to be Rebekah speaking and Dr. Hunter kind of nodding along. And then I want to talk about that for just a sec. And then we'll get into some other ones that help us kind of frame the rest of this conversation. So let's hop over here, and we should be able to hear this. Here we go.
So, and Christian, just to be clear for people who don't know you, who are watching, Dr. Hunter is very unique in that he is not a creationist, and he's not actually even an intelligent design advocate. He's approaching this topic from a scientific viewpoint. But the reason we're bringing the religion into it is because evolution developed in a religious context.
Okay. So you'll notice that Rebekah there said he's not a creationist, he's not even really an intelligent design proponent, and Dr. Hunter kind of nods along with that. And this is really interesting because, as we'll see, he's going to use arguments that are just textbook creationist arguments, just straight out of the usual thing that creationists say. And then, so it's kind of rich for him to just say, I'm not a creationist. He'll, as we'll see, he'll like cite Genesis, right? Okay. And then later on, all the way at the end, I've made a separate video on this, but all the way at the end, he takes a question from a commenter basically saying, you know, it sure seems like you're an intelligent design proponent. Like, really? You're not? And so he doesn't really give an answer. He hems and haws a little bit and doesn't actually give a straight answer. And rather than show like the 2 minutes of that clip, I'll just cut right to the chase. Dr. Hunter is a Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture fellow. He is a fellow at the Intelligent Design think tank. So, let's just be clear. Dr. Hunter is an intelligent design proponent, just straight up. I don't know how there could be any disagreement about that. He's a fellow at the Center for Science and Culture. That's the number one, really the only intelligent design think tank. If you are in some way professionally affiliated with the modern intelligent design movement, you're affiliated with Discovery Institute. That's just how it is. So I'm going to refer to Dr. Hunter as a creationist and as an intelligent design proponent. Now, those two things are the same thing. We've known that, for at least for 20 years, going back to the Dover trial with the definitions, where they use the same definition in the various editions of the textbook that started off as a creationist textbook, and then it became an intelligent design textbook, but the definitions were the same. And then also from the greatest typo of all time, of course, C design proponents is. So you could say creationism, you could say intelligent design, they're the same thing, right? So I'm going to use one or the other as appropriate as we go through this. Dr. Hunter is kind of reluctant to describe himself as either, but it's clear where he's coming from. He is a creationist. He is an intelligent design proponent. Let's just all be clear about that before we go any further. These next two setup clips I'm going to show you are Dr. Hunter describing his own expertise in the field of evolutionary biology and the topic we're going to be talking about here tonight. So I show these to basically give the audience an idea of his level of expertise that he's bringing to the table, because we're going to evaluate his claims in the context of that self-described level of expertise. So let me do this one, and then there's a short one we'll do right after, and then we'll go back to the beginning, and we'll kind of work our way through his claims about virus evolution. So first, let's take a look at this.
Well, I when I discourse with evolutionists, typically I will know more than they do.
Okay, so when he discourses with evolutionists, typically he will know more than they do. Now, I do want to point out, you can see the question on the screen that led to this answer. It's from friend of the channel, Andrew Cumming. Andrew, thank you for your contributions during this live stream. It helped move the discussion along, I think. This one is interesting. I do just want to point out that Andrew asked about evolutionary biologists, and Dr. Hunter responded with evolutionists, which are not the same thing, right? Andrew's asking specifically about, the people who work in the field, maybe being a little bit better informed than you are, right? And Dr. Hunter, to be clear, has a degree in biophysics. So, he's familiar with biological systems, but he is not an evolutionary biologist, right? That's, I think, an important distinction here, as is the distinction between evolutionary biologist and evolutionist. Here's the third and final little setup clip I want to show everybody here. And you can see that I commented at this point. I was hopping in and out of the live chat. I was busy throughout the day, but a couple times during the 2 hours, I was able to hop in for a few minutes and comment a couple of times. And he had responded to something I said earlier. And I pointed out that, like, my PhD is specifically in this. Like, I'm an evolutionary biologist, and my graduate work was on viral evolution. That's what my dissertation is on. So this is what he said as part of his response to that. Just check out this teeny little bit here.
Yes, I am aware of the literature. That's why I made the video. That's a part of the video that I made on viruses and my knowledge of viruses. I am up on the evolution of virus literature.
Okay, so he is up on the evolution of virus literature. Cool. I show you these clips, particularly those second two there. I'm familiar with the literature, and when I talk to evolutionists, I usually know more than they do, because that is important context for the rest of what we're going to see here. Because what we're going to see is a whole bunch of incorrect statements, misinformation, and straw man. And when that kind of thing comes from somebody who says, I'm an expert in this, I'm familiar with this, I'm even more familiar in this thing than the people on the other side who I talk to about it, that tells me that you now have a responsibility to accurately represent it in big ways and in small ways, right? And now, because he has said, I am an expert in this, I'm going to be a lot more comfortable saying, okay, then you're lying about it. And in fact, during this live stream, one of the things that happened was, it might have been right after that moment, where I commented in the side chat and said, okay, I'm now comfortable saying he's lying. I'm not just saying he's wrong, but he's now said, I'm familiar with the literature, I know more about this than they do. Okay, so now I'm comfortable saying you're lying. And I'm going to go down, I'm going to use that approach here because we just heard Dr. Hunter's own assessment of his own level of expertise. I'm going to take that at face value, but then when he gets things wrong, that doesn't mean he's uninformed. That means he's lying. So that's why I showed those clips to start. It kind of contextualizes a lot of the rest of what we're going to be talking about here. So now we can go back to the beginning and we can watch a bunch of selected clips and talk about them. So now we're all the way back to the beginning, so let's get right into it.
Well, guess what? Yes, the scientific evidence contradicts the evolution of viruses.
That's the first thing I want to show you. That's basically his thesis that he's bringing to the table here, that the scientific evidence that we have contradicts the evolution of viruses. I don't have much to say about that. Obviously, I disagree with it, and we'll talk about specifics as we go, but I want to just show that as kind of the setup for the rest of what we're going to be talking about. So now we can go to the next clip.
The evolution of viruses is not indicated by the scientific evidence, and it's refuting evolution.
Okay, so that's a very strong claim. The evolution of viruses is not just unsupported, it actually refutes evolution. Now, I think that's silly because I am someone who has watched viruses evolve in the lab. Obviously not literally because you can't see them, and that's a problem for some creationists. I don't know if Dr. Hunter is in the you literally need to watch it happen camp, but I can, go back to my old lab notebooks and you can see how I sample the viruses on one day, sequence their DNA, they grow overnight, I sample them the next day, and they're different. Mutations have occurred, they've evolved. Evolution is just changes in allele frequencies over generations. Now, Dr. Hunter is talking about things like the origin of viruses. How do you get new viruses? How do you get different groups of viruses? Well, we're going to get into that in a little more detail as we go. But just right off the bat, the idea that somehow we don't have evidence or an understanding of viral evolution is not really a serious claim. especially coming from someone who, as we just heard, is up on the virus evolution literature. This next section that we'll talk about here is about the Mimi virus. It's one of the largest known viruses. It's in a group of viruses called the NCLDVs, the nucleocytoplasmic large DNA viruses. And for my money, they're one of the most fascinating groups of viruses because their genomes contain genes from all three domains of life. And that's going to be important in just a few minutes here. But I want to just highlight a couple of things, again, from the expert who is up on the literature here. So let's hear what he has to say about Mimi viruses.
Now zoom in on one of the viruses, and there is a Mimi virus zoomed in, and what a beautiful little machine that is. Look how symmetric it is and polished off.
Okay, just right off the bat, I want to point out here that that hexagonal thing you see in the picture right there, that's the Mimi virus. It's not symmetrical. It's just not. This is like a very well-known thing about this group of viruses, is that they have this icosahedral morphology, but it's not symmetrical. There's actually one side that's a little bit different from the rest of the virus, and that's the side that actually opens up to release the membrane that contains the genome when it infects the host cell. And again, I want to point out that he knows more about this than evolutionists. He's familiar with the literature. I'm going to point out things like that because you shouldn't be making mistakes like that if you're going to claim to be the expert in the room on that topic. I know that sounds trivial, but you got to get the details right.
Ready to go and infect more cells. So the evolution of this Mimi virus, there's no explanation for it. There's no sequence of mutations. What mutations happened? What was the sequence? How is this thing? How did it evolve? There's no such thing. Zip. There's nothing to explain how this Mimi virus evolved. Now, it's much more complicated than the smaller typical viruses, but there's no scientific explanation for how one of the small viruses evolved. There's no scientific explanation, no step-by-step sequence of mutations, sequence of events for the evolution of any virus.
What do you even say to that, folks? Like, there's no sequence of events, known series of mutations for the evolution of any virus? So first, let's just talk about Mimi virus for a second here. Mimi virus, again, it's one of these giant viruses. It's in this NCLDV group. And there are a number of hypotheses on the evolution of these viruses. So the two main ones are that they existed in the as replicators in the pre-cellular world. And I really favor hypotheses like this because it jives well with the metabolism first view of abiogenesis, which I think is more likely than something like an RNA peptide structure first situation. And so you have cycles of reactions that are happening, and then they become contained, and different kind of subsets of those cycles become contained in different structures, and those represent cells, viruses, transposons, plasmids, right? Various replicating biological entities, right? The other hypothesis of Mimi virus origins, there's papers on all of this. You could just find this stuff. The other hypothesis is that they originated from the early population of cells prior to the divergence between domains bacteria and archaea, and that explains why their genomes, the modern genomes of the giant viruses, contain genes that are homologous to the genes in all three domains, right? So they actually diverge before that, so you get a representation of kind of that ancestral gene pool before it diverged into the three domains of cellular life that we see today. There's two reasonable hypotheses right there for the origin of that virus, and both of those hypotheses have evidence in their favor, and there's observations that are contradictory with them. So is it an open question how these viruses evolved? Absolutely. Is it true that we have no idea how these viruses evolved? Nope, not even close. And to then go on to say we don't have any idea how any virus evolved. I mean, we just experienced a global pandemic that we know happened from a zoonotic transmission event into humans, and we know that there are mutations associated with that because we have sequences from the environment that have the ancestral states, and we have the derived human infecting states. We have HIV, and we know exactly which population of SIV HIV evolved from. Say we can't explain the origins of any specific virus is just astonishing to hear that come out of somebody's mouth. Again, I'll point out that he said he's up on the virus evolution literature. I don't know. It sure seems like there's stuff in there if you look for it. Now, you can look at all those papers and say, nuh-uh. You could read the Mimi virus papers and say, I don't believe that's a plausible explanation. You could find other authors that say, I don't think that explanation's right. Here's my alternative. Okay, pick one. To say, oh, these authors present the evidence for A and try to say B is wrong. These authors present the evidence for B and try to say A is wrong. You can't look at that and claim we don't have any ideas about how this happened. We have several. Do we know which one it is definitively? No. But to say we don't have any idea, we have no pathway of evolution, that's kind of silly. And to say we don't have, even to say we don't have a specific mutational pathway, we literally have that for lots of viruses. A specific, here's the ancestor, here's what we have in the present day, here's the pathway. We literally have that for a number of viruses. So, I don't know. 2009 H1N1 influenza is another great one. It's a quadruple reassortment. Human, swine, bird, and then avian-like swine. And they all came together. It's a quadruple reassortment followed by mutation accumulation. I don't know what to say, folks. It's what he just said isn't true. It's that simple. Just a short one to kind of follow up on this idea that I'll just show you right here.
There's no plausible explanation for a single virus.
Completely wrong. Again, completely wrong and not a serious thing to say. I'll give you another example, one that I like because these are viruses that I studied in graduate school. It's a group of single-stranded DNA plant-infecting viruses called Gemini viruses. And what I think is the best hypothesis for how they evolved is that they started off as plasmids and they acquired the gene for the capsid protein, the viral protein coat, via horizontal gene transfer. So you have plasmids that then became viruses. And I think the evidence for this is quite robust. So here's the paper for this. And the relevant figure that, what I think is the relevant figure for this is right here. And that gray group in the middle, those are the viruses that we're talking about. And if you zoom in on this, and I'll link this paper down below, you'll see that the viruses, they're the protein that triggers the viral replication, that protein, the rep, this is what's called the rep protein, or the replication-associated protein, that sequence nests phylogenetically within the plasmid rep proteins. But the capsid protein obviously does not. Its sequence, the plasmids don't have capsids because they're a different entity. So the capsid is a different thing, but the replicase, or the replication-associated protein, I should say, nests within the plasmid reps, which is strong evidence that the plasmid is the ancestor of that group of viruses. Now, other authors disagree on that. They think there's an alternative history for that. Fair enough. That's fine. I think the evidence is stronger for this hypothesis. People can disagree. Dr. Hunter can disagree. That's fine. To say we don't have the ideas, we don't have the plausible pathways, is silly. They're right there. And you could do this for lots of different groups of viruses. So this one, we don't need to listen to anything right here, but I just want to point this out because he's citing a paper here. And so the lead author here on this paper that he is citing is this guy, I think the way to pronounce his name is Krupovich. And so he's citing this paper where Mart Krupovich is the lead author. That matters because that Gemini virus paper I just showed you, same lead author. And when I presented that via email to Dr. Hunter, I'm not going to show the emails, but his response was basically that, well, the authors are coming to that with an evolutionary bias and they have their preconceived notions, so we can't really trust, their accounting here. They're not asking the right questions. They're not asking if it evolved, they're asking how it evolved. And I just want everyone to appreciate that he's citing the same author, that when I gave him a paper by that author that addresses his concern, his response was bias in the authors. And okay, now we're going to talk about a part where he brings up the concept that viruses are polyphyletic, as though it is a problem for evolutionary theory. So before we get into this, let's do a quick little review about basic phylogenetics here. So in phylogenetics, you can make 3 types of groups on a phylogenetic tree, and here they are. So the first group is called monophyletic. These groups are also called clades. A monophyletic group is common ancestor and all of the descendants. And that's useful because you can build nested hierarchies using monophyletic groups. You could do the box in a box kind of thing with monophyletic groups, and you can't do those with the other 2 types of groups. The second type of group, which is shown now, is a paraphyletic group. That's where you have a common ancestor and you have some of the descendants, but not all of them. You omit some of the descendants from that group. That's something like, for example, the way we classically think of reptiles, right? So you think of reptiles, you're probably thinking of something green and scaly, not something with feathers. But birds are nested within the reptile clade. So when you think about reptiles in such a way that excludes the birds, you're describing a paraphyletic grouping. If you want to make reptiles monophyletic, you have to include the birds, right? And then the third type of group, this one is what we're talking about right here. A polyphyletic group is a group where you include multiple lineages, but not the common ancestor that all of those lineages share with each other. And viruses are polyphyletic. In other words, viruses have multiple independent origins. They didn't all come from a single viral ancestor. Now, all cellular life came from a single cellular ancestor. And there's lots of ways we know that. I've talked about it at length. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more in a little bit, so we'll get there. But for right now, I just want everyone to know that viruses are polyphyletic. They're actually very different from each other across the different groups. Off the top of my head, I don't know how many different independent lineages of viruses we have at this point, but the basic way we classify viruses is this thing called the Baltimore system, where viruses are classified according to what's called their genomic architecture. So their genomes can be single-stranded or double-stranded. They could be DNA or RNA. They could even be retrotranscribing, where they start as RNA and then they go back to DNA and they do stuff with the DNA. And so, those are retroviruses, are most of those. So it's long been recognized that those different groups are independent of each other, right? That's not like a controversial thing. So I want to just kind of give you that background here on polyphyly and viral polyphyly before we get into this clip I want to show you. But now that we've done that, we can watch this clip here.
So what is this polyphyletic? So remember, the key sub-hypothesis of evolutionary theory is common descent. You have to have common descent. Well, you don't have to have it, but it is very important. You want to have common descent. All of the species came from this LUCA, last universal common ancestor. All of the viruses came from this common virus ancestor.
No, they didn't. That's long been recognized. That's not an open question, and it hasn't been for as long as we've been studying viruses in a systematic way. It's just, this is not true.
Ancestor. It didn't work. They had to divide viruses into different realms, and each realm has its own common ancestor. So you do not have overall universal common ancestry for viruses.
Correct. You don't have universal common ancestry for viruses. There are multiple independent origins for viruses, just like there are multiple independent origins for endotherms, for marine mammals, for example. For, I think, what else? Snakes, I think, are polyphyletic. Don't at me if I'm wrong. Don't do that. various types of algae, right? There's at least two independent origins for green algae. There's the main archaeplastids, and then there's the pollinella, right? And those are separate from each other, but they're landing in the same place, right? Yeah, polyphyly is a thing. You just don't base your classification system on polyphyly because you can't make a nested hierarchy using polyphyletic groups, right? So why this is supposed to be a problem for evolution, I don't know. But let's continue.
Now, why is that so important in evolution? My understanding is that it's because it's so hard and implausible to even get these things to come about once that we need it to be only once, because otherwise it's just multiplying the problems exponentially. So is that the main reason that's driving that it has to be common ancestry?
I think you could say that's the main reason, but there's a...
Wait a minute, what? No, you can't. You can't say that's the main reason at all. The reason that we propose universal common ancestry for cellular life, and we don't do that for viruses, is genome sequence comparisons and the pattern of similarities and differences. Like, how can you, a serious person, get a question that we just heard and go, yeah, I think that's the main reason? This is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about misinformation, right? And that, again, let's go back to what we watched at the beginning, when he said, when I talk to evolutionists, I know more about this than they do. Okay, you're claiming a very robust understanding of the field of evolutionary biology. Why can't you accurately portray the evidence for it? Why can't you say in response to that question, well, no, the reason that, say it in the way you want to say it, say the reason that evolutionists believe in universal common ancestry for cells is because they compare the genomes and they form a nested hierarchy. And they can trace that back to Luca, they claim. And therefore they say that means there's universal common ancestry, right? Just say that. You can then go on some nonsense about common design and how you don't believe it, whatever. You can say that, but like start by accurately presenting the evidence. And just, we can't. I don't know why we can't, but we can't. And that's frustrating to me. But here we are. That's the end of this kind of early section that I wanted to comment on. So now we're going to do a big time jump in this video. We're going to skip the part in the middle that's not about viruses, but we're going to come back when Rebekah starts taking questions from the audience and putting up some comments from the live chat in there. We're going to come back to this topic. So I'm going to comment on some of that conversation because I think there's some important claims in there to address and some important things to point out that I would like for everybody to see. So here we go with the first little bit. I just want to point out here.
And now here I'm seeing this as a consensus position, all leading, all biologists around, in academia, vociferously holding to this. There must be something really powerful. It's not exactly obvious. It's kind of, non-intuitive that, the world arose by chance. Okay, that's interesting. Let's have a look at that. And then you dig into it and you realize, well, wait a minute.
Okay. Again, the strawmanning, right? You all know what's good, like what the answer is to that, right? By chance? Evolution isn't all just by chance. There are random processes, but I don't even like the word random. I like either probabilistic or stochastic, I think are better words to use than random. I've talked about this before, but random gives the idea that every outcome is equally likely, and that's not true, right? It's kind of a weighted randomness to it. But stochastic or probabilistic are both good words. But then there are other processes of evolution, like selection, non-random mating, that are extremely non-random, right? Natural selection is selective. You have differential survival and reproduction based on possessing certain heritable traits. So for an expert in the field who knows more about this than evolutionists, and yes, I'm going to keep pointing out that he said that, to present evolution as a process that's all by chance, it's a random process in its entirety, is a ridiculous straw man. And like, I'd say he should know better, but he's told us he knows better, so he's just lying when he says that. It's just silly. And then the other kind of side of this is like, all these experts believe this thing. Oh, maybe there's something to it. Yeah, maybe. Maybe you should look into it. Maybe you should read not just the papers, but the kind of textbooks, or go back historically and look at how the fields develop over time, and not just with an eye looking for quotes that you can pull, but to genuinely have an understanding of the foundations of the field, right? And that's kind of the heart of the comment that I showed earlier from Andrew Cumming at the beginning. Yeah, it's like, maybe there's something here that you're not getting. And he kind of like gets up to that idea right here and then says, nah. But yeah, there's clearly something here that he's either not getting or refusing to understand, or just gets and is lying about. And I'll leave it to the audience to decide which of those things is the case.
Now, there are a few papers that have come out and have disputed this and said, gee, maybe life is not monophyletic because the evidence, because the universal common ancestor has failed so badly.
That's just silly. The vast majority of the evidence out there points to a universal common ancestor, and we don't predict a perfect nested hierarchy based on processes that are well understood, like convergence and incomplete lineage sorting. Far and away, the best, most likely, and most parsimonious explanation for the pattern of biodiversity that we observe is universal common ancestry of cellular life. And I have been on this hobby horse for a while now that the single best thing you can point to here is the specific nested hierarchical pattern, and in particular, the nested hierarchical pattern in the unconstrained regions. I've pointed this out before, but the short version is that you can create the different lineages with whatever pattern of similarity you want. You cannot get the observed pattern that we have today via separate ancestry, because evolution between creation and the present will disrupt whatever that pattern is. So the only way to get the pattern we see is for subsets of the mutations that have occurred throughout history to occur not in the lineages individually or independently, but to have occurred in the common ancestors of those lineages prior to their divergence from each other. And that's how you get the observed pattern. And those same processes also explain where we see violations of that pattern via things like horizontal gene transfer, to name another one. Here's another one where, based on what he said that I showed earlier, he should clearly, or does clearly, know better than what we're about to hear right here.
Certainly, viruses would have been predicted to be monophyletic.
No. And again, you could go back to the Baltimore system. And this is before we had like robust genome sequencing and we could actually do the comparisons in the phylogenetics. Just looking at the genomic architecture, viruses were sorted into these separate groups according to the Baltimore classification. So what he just said is wrong. And since he is up on the virus evolution literature, he's lying. And it seems like he is misrepresenting the history there in order to make it seem like there was a failed prediction. And then when the prediction was shown to be incorrect, evolutionists just went, oh, that doesn't matter anyway, it's fine. Viruses, once we saw that they had different genomic architectures, the consensus was, oh, these groups all originated independently of each other. But that's not what's being presented here. So now we're going to get into some stuff related to the fossil record and what processes can explain the fossil record. And this is a longer clip. I'm going to let this one play for actually almost 2 minutes. And then the next one is also going to be a little bit longer. But it's, I think, useful to see kind of how Dr. Hunter talks about the fossil record and the processes that could generate the fossil record that we observe. So let's take a look at this.
Evolutionists are grappling with. They don't fit evolutionary theory.
And also, Andrew, does having fossils actually show us the evolution? Because we find fossils, and we find fossils of complex organisms with no predecessor And so...
Okay, this is again where I just want to point out, Rebekah has been like directly shown like, hey, here's fossils that show that you're wrong, like straight up. And she still repeats this, I'm going to call it misinformation. This is just a standard creationist talking point and it's wrong. And here's Rebekah just, even though if she doesn't know better, it's because she has refused to acknowledge the information that has been directly presented to her. Let's put it that way.
How is that helping us explain things? We have all these fully formed organisms. So I don't really...
Again, the fully formed, sudden appearance fossil record, typical creationist talking points, been explained. She's not going to hear it. She's just going to go back to the talking points.
How finding fossils of viruses would help.
From an evolutionary perspective, I would say that fossils have helped us tremendously, so that because they give us more evidence about the world and about biology, and they show us that evolution didn't work.
But how so? Can you tell us more of your perspective on that? How did they show us that evolution didn't work?
Exactly what you just said.
Okay.
It's just this unbelievable complexity, as though planted there, as Richard Dawkins admitted. So the trilobites and the trilobite eyes, it just makes no sense. They're not in the right order. They don't go from simple to complex. You have complexity preceding simplicity often. You have incredible early complexity, and they just don't follow the evolutionary expectations.
I mean, that's just completely wrong. That is completely wrong. And like trilobites are an example where that's a Cambrian group. A lot of creationists get this wrong, but a great resource on this is Jackson Wheat. On his channel, he has talked extensively about the Precambrian biodiversity and how, as we've collected more fossils, because the fossil record is famously incomplete, and we keep finding more stuff, and as we find more fossils, we keep finding earlier transition forms that are indicative of the forms that we're going to see later in the Cambrian. What creationists like to do here, the trick that they like to do, is take the end of Cambrian fossils and represent those as representative of the entire Cambrian period, which spanned approximately 50 million years. There's a lot of evolution that occurs in those 50 million years, and the early Cambrian specimens that we have are way more ancestral in their morphology compared to the late Cambrian specimens. It's similar to an analogy that people might be more familiar with, a group that people might be more familiar with, is looking at the hominins, the lineage that is on the human branch after the human-chimp split 6 to 7 million years ago, right? The hominins are the human branch of that, and Homo sapiens are the only living hominins, right? What they're doing with this Cambrian stuff when they talk about various Cambrian specimens is that they're often doing the equivalent of pointing to Homo sapiens and saying, look at that sudden appearance. There's no transition from the more ancestral ape-like form to these Homo sapiens specimens we find that the evolutionists say go back 200,000 or 300,000 years. There's a lot of other stuff in that lineage that's a lot older than that, that's a lot more ancestral in terms of their morphology, right? But creationists tend to skip over those types of things in the context of the Cambrian and take the most well-known specimens that are often from the late Cambrian and represent those as representative of the entire period. And that's all I'm going to say about that, because it's not my field specifically. And there are people who are better able to comment on this. Jackson Wheat is my go-to resource for stuff like that. So you should check out his channel if you wanted to get more information on that stuff.
Yes, you can pick out, you can filter and pick out a sequence, which has been done many times in many textbooks, and show a what looks to be an evolutionary sequence. Aha, there you go.
Yeah, no, so here's the thing. Given that we know that the fossil record is incomplete and like the environment has to be very particular for fossils to form, do you think it's more likely that the so-called gaps in the fossil record, the sudden appearances that creationists claim, do you think that's more likely to be that those things did actually suddenly appear through some act of divine intervention? Or that maybe those organisms didn't readily fossilize because their environment wasn't conducive to it, so we just don't have the specimens that we do for other things, right? It's not coincidence that, for example, one of the best fossil series that we have are the whales, right? And we can look at specific morphological features that allow us to connect tetrapod fossils with more whale-like fossils, and you kind of daisy chain them together based on both geographically, temporally, where they lived, and also overlap in specific morphological features like their ankle bones or their ear bones. Okay? In the places where we don't have that level of detail in the fossil record, what's a better explanation? That they didn't fossilize, or that they never existed?
But that's it's not a scientific objective rendition of the evidence. It's a theory laden perspective where you pick out it's confirmation testing. You find the evidences that fit your theory and you put that in the textbook.
I just want to point out that, like, that's how you do science, is you make predictions and then you test those predictions. And when you have confirmed predictions, that's evidence in favor of your hypothesis. Like what he just described is like gathering evidence, right? Now, sometimes the predictions are wrong and you got to abandon your hypothesis. Okay, right? But oftentimes we can predict what kind of morphological things we expect to see in fossils and where we expect to find those fossils in terms of their location in the geological column and geographically on Earth. And when those predictions are accurate, as they have been frequently, that's evidence in favor of the evolutionary hypothesis.
Well, that brings me, I want to ask my question because someone came on and recently challenged me about the overall ordering of the fossil record and said, nothing but evolution can explain this because, even though there might be problems with a sudden appearance of certain forms, but in general, we see, simple, like you see single-celled organisms, then you see multicellular organisms, then you see, progress that looks like
reptiles, amphibians, reptiles, mammals, birds. There is a general order, and it's non-random. There's a trend. That is a claim. Ridley made that in his.
I mean, that's not just a claim. That's an observable fact, right? It's not just a claim. It's an observable fact, right? You don't find mammals before a certain point in the fossil record. You don't find reptiles before a certain point. You don't find flowering plants. You don't find seed plants. You don't find vascular plants. You don't find multicellularity, right? It's not just a claim. It is a direct observation. And if creationists can't just just acknowledge what is obviously true from direct observation, then I don't know where to go with that. To say the sequence that we see in the fossil record, oh, that's a claim. No, that's observable reality. It's not more complicated than that.
Mark Ridley makes that in his evolution textbook as an evidence for evolution in his chapter on evidence for evolution. That is something Jerry Cohen has made that argument in his book, Why Evolution is True. You do have this general trend. It's non-random. All this comes up from the principle of plenitude. God wouldn't do it that way. So
what? That's ridiculous. Like that, the idea that we look at the fossil record and we conclude evolution because we say God wouldn't do it that way. And he says it all comes from that. That's what he just said. In fact, let's go back 10 seconds and watch it again. See what he says.
In his book, Why Evolution is True, you do have this general trend. It's non-random. All this comes up from the principle of plenitude.
All this comes from the principle. All of it. That is an egregious straw man of the evidence for evolution, the position that evolutionary biologists hold, how we draw our conclusions. That is ridiculous. No biologist bases their conclusions on God wouldn't do it that way. The conversation that Rebekah mentioned there, I believe was with friend of the channel Grayson. Grayson doesn't make his arguments that way. I don't. I never have. I just don't. I don't know what else to say about that. Nobody does that. It's just an absolutely ridiculous straw man. And like, how do you reason with somebody who is willing to present their opponent's arguments that way when they claim that they're experts in their opponent's fields here? It's just like, it's very discouraging. The state of the discourse is very discouraging when you hear something like that. Jumping ahead just a little bit here, but we're in the same kind of part of the conversation.
Evolutionists, a scientist would say something like, my theory predicted X, and we found X. That's pretty good. Yeah.
Yes, that's exactly what we do, and when we do that, that's evidence in favor of your hypothesis. Like, yeah, I don't know what else to say to that. That's just how it is. Yeah.
Wow, that is pretty good. Good job. That doesn't mean your theory is true.
Correct. That doesn't mean your theory is true, but it is evidence in favor of your theory. Yes, that is how science works. Thank you for describing how science works.
By the way, do you understand that? Because that would be the fallacy of affirming the consequent. So you don't want to make that mistake. In fact,
yeah, we don't. That's not how we do it. Thank you. Appreciate it. We got it. We're good. We'll check in with you if we need to make sure, but we got that one. Continuing along this with the fossil record here, Rebekah's going to ask a question, and you'll see.
But do you think in general the order proceeds according to a development, a slow development of life over time?
Yeah, I mean, when I read Genesis, I did see an order. First there was the teeming things in the ocean, the little things in the ocean, and then there was the land things, and then there was man came last. I mean, it's kind of funny that there was an order in Genesis. So a creationist could make the exact same claim.
Okay. No, you can't. Okay, so first, in Genesis, you've got like all the ocean things, then the land things. So if the fossil record was based on the order of creation, then you would have like sharks and whales and trilobites and jellyfish all together. But you don't have those. They appear sequentially over time because they didn't all live at the same time way back in the past, right? They didn't all appear at the same time. But according to Genesis, they would have appeared at the same time. Second, the problem here for creationists making that particular claim is that the consensus among creationists is that the flood is responsible for the fossil record, not creation order during Genesis, right? So those two things are separate. Most of the geological column and the fossils therein are the result of the global flood. Whereas Genesis creation would have happened earlier and not specifically informed how we see things in the fossil record. But also, can we just appreciate that we saw earlier, he's not a creationist, he's not an intelligent design guy. The man just cited Genesis in response to someone making a point about the ordering in the fossil record. He cited Genesis. What's the word for someone who cites Genesis? A creationist. He's a creationist. Like, why? I don't know why he couldn't just say that up front. Like, clearly he's a creationist if he's citing Genesis. It's ridiculous. Lastly, I'll just point out here briefly of the mechanisms on the table to explain what we see in the fossil record, evolution, some, flood-related mechanism like hydrological sorting or whatever, and the Genesis creation order. The only thing that's been proposed that can explain the ordering that we see in the fossil record is the process of evolution operating over long periods of time. That's it. Does that mean that is the only potential option? Maybe, maybe not. I invite creationists to come up with a workable alternative. But right now, of the options on the table, only evolution can explain the observations that we have. We're going to continue on this vein, but there is a specific important thing that I want to point out with this little bit here. So let's just check this out.
And you asked me, is that support for evolution? Does that? What do you say about that? I mean, is that an evidence for evolution? Yes, that's a confirmed prediction or retrodiction, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, that's evidence for evolution. There's tons of evidence for evolution. Every similarity you find between any species is right off the bat evidence for evolution, because that's one of the predictions. Now, when you look at the details of those similarities, they end up having problems and
Now, here's the thing. What he's getting into there, you look at the details, it's not perfect, it's not a perfect nested hierarchy, it's complicated. Yeah. And it's not just the pattern of similarities that are evidence for evolution. It's the pattern of similarities and differences across the different groups. And this is like one of the key things here. It's the pattern of similarities and the pattern of differences as you go backwards in time and you group organisms with more distant common ancestors, right? It's the similarities and the differences. And within those clades, within those monophyletic groups, you also specifically predict some degrees of discordance with the overall pattern due to processes like horizontal gene transfer and incomplete lineage sorting, among others, right? Those are predicted, and we can actually, for example, predict how much of the gorilla genome should be more similar to the human than to the chimp, based on incomplete lineage sorting. We can make that prediction, and we get it right, right? So it's not just the similarities. We should also understand that it's the differences that allow us to construct that pattern that indicate universal common ancestry of all cellular life. All right, now we're going to get another one of these straw men of the evolution position here. And again, I'm going to keep pointing these out because he said he's an expert. He says he understands this stuff. Then why can't you accurately represent it? So let me show you.
So this idea that the fossil records are non-random, that comes right out of the principle of plenitude, and how any non-random trends, God wouldn't have done it that way. And so therefore, creationism must be false, and therefore what? Evolution must be true.
It's just ridiculous. Nobody cares. No evolutionary biologist cares. I just want to say this to like creationists in general when you're thinking about like practicing evolutionary biologists and how we go about our work on a daily basis. I'm weird in that I talk to you and talk about you and talk about creationism as a hobby. I'm weird. Nobody else does this. If you bring it up, like, oh, did you see what so-and-so wrote? You know, this guy, Nathaniel Jeanson at Answers in Genesis, see what he wrote about mitochondrial Eve? People look at you like you have 3 heads. I just need creationists to understand that nobody working in the field of evolutionary biology thinks about you at all. This song is not about you. We're off doing our own thing, doing our own work, doing real science, figuring stuff out. Nobody thinks about creationism. Nobody thinks about how God would do something and what would be consistent with or contradict that. We just don't. And you have to understand that. None of the basis for our conclusions come from the idea of how a God would operate. They just don't. And it's a straw man to say we do. And Dr. Hunter does that multiple times here. Why can't he engage with the actual arguments people make? Why does he have to invent this argument that no evolutionary biologists are making? I don't know, but he said he's really familiar with the field, which to me says that he's lying. He's deliberately misrepresenting it. Because if you're familiar with it and you're not representing it accurately, you're lying about it. So now we're back to virus evolution. He's going to talk about how we don't have an explanation for virus evolution, and like, here we go again. Let's see.
This problem that you there's nothing even close to a step-by-step explanation for the origin of a single virus. Nothing even close to that.
Like, I don't know what to tell you, man. Like, if you want step-by-step explanation for the origin of a single virus, 2009 H1N1. Here you go. Step by step. You want more detail than that? I don't know what to tell you. Like, that is a step-by-step account of how this virus originated. You had co-infection of a single host with several strains of influenza. They underwent reassortment, and then that triple reassortment underwent co-infection and reassortment with another strain. 2009 H1N1 pandemic. There you go. If that's not good enough, I don't know what to tell you. And we could do that for like a lot of viruses. We do that for HIV, for example, right? Now, if you want to go back to like the Baltimore system and you want to know the origins of like not just this lineage of viruses, but like all of the positive sense single-stranded RNA viruses, now you're not going to be able to get that mutation by mutation thing because that happened way in the past, right? And you have a mutation saturation problem, right? So if you're familiar with viral evolution, you know that what you're asking for at that scale is unreasonable. And instead what we can do is you use modern genomics and phylogenetic tools to put together a plausible hypothesis for how this or that group of viruses would have originated from a non-viral ancestor, right? I gave you an example of that earlier with the Gemini viruses. So he keeps saying this thing about how we have no idea about how even a single virus evolves. And as someone who, I consider myself pretty familiar with virus evolution, I have no freaking clue what he's talking about. Because what he's saying is completely at odds with, like, the stuff I read about viral evolution, because I'm into viral evolution, and I like to read about it, and I read about this stuff. And he says he does. Okay, then you're lying about it. I don't know what else to say. I get two more clips I want to show you here. One of them is literally just one quick line right here. It's a couple seconds. I want to point something out. And then there'll be a longer one that we're going to end with this. Oh, and then there is one more that'll put a little bow on everything for us. But we're almost done here, folks. This short one first, let's just see this real quick.
It's not just merely irreducible complexity, although irreducible complexity is a monumental problem with evolutionary theory.
All right, let's just to be clear, we have directly observed the evolution of irreducibly complex features. That is a thing that we have directly observed. My two favorite molecular examples are the Lenski sit+ trait. That is an irreducibly complex trait. It requires a duplication and several other mutations. If you don't have all of them, it doesn't work. Therefore, it's irreducibly complex. And the other is a specific protein in HIV that has acquired a new function. It's specifically HIV1 group M, and the protein is the VPU protein. It has an ancestral function. In the SIV ancestral virus, it has a new function in addition to the old one in HIV, and that new function requires somewhere between 4 to 7 mutations to do, and it involves the evolution of 3 new binding sites, protein-protein binding sites, that didn't exist in the ancestral virus that enable it to do this new function. That is an irreducibly complex trait. We know when HIV evolved, so unless you're positing that the designer is intervening in real time to make HIV, then that is another documented example, directly documented example of the evolution of an irreducibly complex structure. So no, irreducible complexity is not a problem for evolution. Just let's be clear on that. Okay, this section I'm going to show you is pretty long. We're going to go through it, and we're going to pause and talk periodically as we go through these few minutes here, because, folks, this section is a genuinely wild ride, to the extent that when he started, my initial reaction was, oh, he misread the question, and he's answering a different question. He thinks, you can see right on screen, this is B.S. Lewis right here, he says, if I believe in microevolution, and am I an evolutionist? And I initially thought, upon hearing Dr. Hunter begin to answer this question, that he heard and read it as macroevolution. But no, his answer is quite deliberately about microevolution, as in like your basic population genetics changes in allele frequencies within populations. That is what he is talking about here, as you will see. So we're gonna see this. Folks, this is, I hope you've stayed this long to watch the video, because it is a trip. Here we go.
And B.S. Lewis said, if I believe in microevolution, am I an evolutionist?
Yeah, good question. So I cannot answer that without asking you a question, which is why? Why do you believe in microevolution? Because typically microevolution arguments are religious, are theological.
That was where I was like, oh, he thought they were asking about macroevolution. No. He's meaning to talk about it this way.
But not always. And so it all depends on, why do you believe that? Because microevolution does fail and fail badly in a lot of instances. So
what?
We're disputing basic population genetics now, folks. We are so far beyond what most creationists will dispute, because I want to just be clear about this. In terms of like the scale of evolutionary change, virtually all creationists, except for literally one weirdo on YouTube that I could think of, every other creationist who I've ever interacted with accepts that speciation is a thing, right? Now we've got Dr. Hunter here disputing microevolution, calling it a religious idea. That's below speciation in terms of the scale of evolutionary change. This is just like your basic pop gen mechanisms, right? Selection, drift, gene flow, that kind of stuff. What?
Oh, I'm like really surprised to hear you say this. I want to hear what you mean.
That's all of us.
Yeah, this is a whole nother topic, but adaptation. So this gets into the question of adaptation, because microevolution is usually talking about adaptation. Species adapt, but they don't become different species. So that you see changes within a species. That's usually what we're talking about with microevolution. And adaptation doesn't come often. As we look under the hood and we learn more about adaptation, it's very complicated. It gets to the irreducible complexity problem, and it doesn't arise from random mutations and natural selection.
I mean, it literally does. That's like the basic mechanism, and we know at like the level of like molecular genetics how that happens. This goes back to another stream he did with Rebekah that I also have lots of thoughts on, where he basically talks about mutations as being, he says adaptive, but what he means is directed. He's using the word adaptive wrong, but he means like directed or purposeful mutations. It's basically continuous environmental tracking is what he's describing. That's what he's getting at right here. He did a whole other long thing on this.
Now, so you're saying it's like something like epigenetic processes that are causing the organism to adapt to the environment, like an intentional change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I call it smart adaptation or directed adaptation. That's not evolution. And
that's not how things work. And it's not a real thing. And we've known that's not a real thing since, no joke, 1943, with the Luria-Delbruck fluctuation test. I talked about this in detail in my video on continuous environmental tracking. I can link that down below. That's what he's getting at right here. It's all nonsense, and we've known it's nonsense for over 80 years. Like, this was an open question at some point in the early history of the field of genetics. It's not an open question anymore. We know the answer to this one.
When you call that evolution, that's what evolutionists do. They take something that they resisted for decades or centuries, harshly, severely criticized, rejected, ruined people's careers who indulged in it, and then now they can no longer deny it. It's undeniable now, and so now they subsume it, and then they integrate it into their theory and say, "Oh yeah, well that's evolution." No, it's not evolution. It could not have evolved. The preponderance of scientific evidence contraindicates evolution.
Okay, see, now he just goes right to evolution can't happen, right? Now we're not talking about like specific mutations and adaptations. We're just, most of the evidence is against evolution, which is just flatly false. It's just wrong. And some creationists, like Todd Wood, will acknowledge that evolution is robustly supported. But other creationists have to dishonestly say it's not. Most creationists, to be fair.
So epigenetic mechanisms are not likely to have evolved. And so why would you say that this is evolution? This is not evolution.
So first of all, this is getting at one of my favorite papers of all time. Kind of gets at the evolution of epigenetic mechanisms. So here's the paper. It's called Confounded Cytosine, and it's great. You should look this up. I'll link it. But it has to do with the transition from RNA to DNA and uracil to thymine. So we use AUCG in RNA and then ATCG in DNA. Those are the 4 bases in each one. The difference is uracil versus thymine. And I love this paper. And you see it's talking about like the tinkering in the evolution of DNA. And that's super cool, because what we have here is a situation where uracil is a problem because cytosine mutates into uracil, and cytosine does this thing called deamination, which is a very rapid type of spontaneous chemical change that results in a mutation. C becomes U. Now, if you use uracil in your genome, then that's a problem, because how do you know if that uracil is actually uracil or if it should be cytosine? If you use thymine, then it's okay, because if you see uracil, you just flip it back to cytosine. You know any uracils there should actually be cytosine, right? So this is actually, we have enzymes that actually patrol our DNA, and anytime we see uracil, we cut it out and we flip it back to cytosine, because we know as the deamination occurred. This is actually a mechanism we use against viruses. So we have enzymes that go around and target cytosines in foreign DNA and convert them to uracil. And so this is an antiviral mechanism that we have. And that works great against an RNA virus. Now, against a DNA virus, the virus can take advantage of the uracil repair mechanisms. This is where epigenetics comes into play, because the primary mechanism of epigenetics is DNA methylation. And where do you methylate? You methylate your cytosines. So here's the great part. If you methylate the cytosines of a DNA virus and then deaminate them with your antiviral enzymes, those methyl cytosines don't become uracil, they become thymine. And now you can't tell, should it be a thymine or should it be a cytosine? The U's don't stick out like sore thumbs like they did, so that's an effective means of targeting DNA viral genomes. You methylate them and then you deaminate those cytosines. That's the basis for methylation as a DNA regulatory mechanism, because what do those viruses do? Some of them integrate. They're retroviruses that have integrase enzymes, so they start off as RNA, they retrotranscribe to DNA, cut your DNA, and put themselves in there. So you need to be able to methylate your own DNA to inhibit the viruses from replicating within your cells. We say that from mobilizing, right? When the viruses are in your DNA and then they activate and they moved somewhere else, we say that they mobilize, right? And in order to prevent that, you can methylate and mutate those invading DNA sequences. That's the basis for epigenetic regulation. This is somebody who knows this better than biologists, better than evolutionary biologists. Really? Because we have like a really cool history of how epigenetics evolved. It's so cool. And he just like pretending this is a thing we have no hope of explaining. Thank you, Dr. Hunter, for giving me an opportunity to talk about that. It is one of my favorite things in evolutionary biology. So at the very least, thank you for that.
So the whole issue of microevolution, you have to consider the complexity and the fact that the mechanisms involved, if they had some...
You can tell he's kind of flailing here. You can tell. Well, understandable, but like you can tell.
Somehow, random mutations had somehow created, say, an epigenetic mechanism, which would be astonishing. It wouldn't be selected for. Why would it not be selected for?
Because it allows you to not get killed from the viruses that invaded your genome. That's why it would be selected for.
Because epigenetic mechanisms are future-looking. They are in anticipation of a future environmental challenge.
No, they're not. Nope, they're not. There's two main things that we see with epigenetic regulation. One is sex-specific regulation. So you have like typical male and female, or maternal and paternal expression patterns embryonically, right? So genes for growth, for example, the maternal copy of that gene will typically be suppressed epigenetically, whereas the paternal copy of that gene will be very highly expressed, right? And you could regulate that epigenetically. The other thing that we see with epigenetics is that it's a biochemical and genetic regulatory response to current conditions in anticipation that those conditions will stay the same. The concept for there's actually a hypothesis that kind of deals with this. It's called the thrifty epigenotype hypothesis, and has to do with things like regulating your metabolic pathways in such a way that if you're in a calorie restricted environment, you're really good at storing excess calories as fat and very stingy about using the reserves, right? And so this can actually cause problems where if you have a lineage or a population that's in a low calorie environment and then the environment changes and they're in a high calorie environment, that's one of the hypotheses for why obesity will then become such a problem within just 1 or 2 generations. It's a mismatch between the environment and the epigenetics. So it's not that the epigenetic regulation is anticipating a future change in the environment. It's the exact opposite, Dr. Hunter. It's that the epigenetic regulation is basically laying down a pattern of gene expression that optimizes the organism for the current environment. And when there's a future mismatch, that tends to cause problems. So it's the opposite, the exact opposite of what he just said. And again, he says he knows this stuff. Doesn't seem like it.
It's not now, it's in the future. Well, selection is all about now. It has to be now. If it's not fitness improving now, it will degrade and go away. And so the preponderance of the evidence is that these are not, they don't fit the evolutionary narrative. And so
very persuasive.
Why would you say that adaptation is evolution? So
that is literally what evolution is. Adaptation refers to either a novel trait or a change in the frequency of a beneficial trait in a population, right? That's literally the definition of evolution.
So I don't even like that. I don't think the term microevolution is a good term.
I actually agree with that. I actually agree with that because it's misleading in that people think micro and macro evolution are distinct sets of processes, and they're not. They're the same.
But I know what it refers to. A small, I call it small scale adaptation or small scale evolution. So yeah, you just need to think about, so there was a religious doctrine going back to Linnaeus and before Linnaeus called the fixity of species.
Mm-hmm.
And that doctrine was that you have a completely static world. It's a creationist doctrine.
Past creationists, to be clear. No modern creationists buy into that, to be clear.
That the world is entirely static. And even Linnaeus, later in his career, dropped this idea because he realizes how foolish this was. So, but you're making it a straw man, 2-dimensional cardboard version of the doctrine of creation, that we have this, static world. And so any change that we detect, no matter how it happens, is a falsifier of creationism and therefore a verifier, a proof text for evolution. And that's a religious argument. The key premise of that argument is God would have made a perfectly static world that has no change at all. It sounds silly, and it sounds like something that no one would ever use today in today's world. Not so. Evolutionists, in modern contemporary evolutionists, make this argument a lot.
Name one. I, consider myself pretty well versed in the evolution creation discourse. I can't think of anybody making that argument. Nobody says, oh, God would have created all the species, and the species don't change. That's the creationist position, and any change from that is evolution. No, Nobody does that. This is an absurd straw man. This is a guy who wants to be taken seriously, and he cannot accurately represent the evolution position. Why is that? Dr. Hunter, why can't you accurately represent the arguments that I and others make? Because what you just said is ridiculous. Why? Why? Why can't you just accurately make the argument? Say, oh, creationists adhere to a forest of life model, and evolutionists adhere to a tree of life model, where there is a single common ancestor, whereas creationists propose multiple common ancestors. And the evolutionists say that the forest of life model is wrong for reasons X, Y, and Z. Why can't you just say that? Then you could say how we're wrong about it, but at least you frame the argument in a way that accurately represents what people like me actually say. Because what you just said was ridiculous. It's just a completely ridiculous straw man that bears no resemblance to the arguments that people actually make. So that's where we can leave the actual content here. There's obviously a lot that I didn't talk about, but this video is already very long, so we don't have to go into any more there. I am going to show you one more clip, and then we're going to call it good. Here's just the very last thing here. This is just a short thing from Rebekah that I think is, I think this is funny.
So we look forward, Dr. Dan, to seeing you make a video on this, showing how viruses evolved, what we know about virus evolution, and, refuting what we said in this video.
Ask and you shall receive. Here we are. You're welcome. So that's where we're going to wrap this one up, folks. Thank you for sticking it out this long. I know this was a long one, but thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed some of that stuff in there. I like that I got to talk about some stuff that I think is really cool, like Gemini viruses and mimivirus and cytosine and uracil and methylation and stuff. I love this stuff. Honestly, I could keep talking about this stuff all night, but no one would watch if I kept doing that. So the last thing that I want to say here is that I have been emailing with Dr. Hunter. I actually emailed him after the previous show on Rebekah's channel, the one where he talked about the directed mutations, and said I would love to have a more technical conversation about this. And he was like, no. But then after this show, he emailed me talking about the virus stuff, and we've been going back and forth, and I don't know, maybe it'll happen, maybe it won't. I'm hopeful, Dr. Hunter, that you would be willing to come on. I would love to talk to you first and foremost about the adaptation and mutation stuff, but I'd also be happy to talk about things like viruses or methylation or whatever. I would love to have you on for a chat because, folks, as you know, I have an open door policy. That's what I do. And I've had lots of, professional credentialed creationists on, and we've always had excellent conversations, because one thing I don't do here is like the YouTube debate bro shtick, right? If I'm going to have somebody on, we're going to get into the weeds and we're going to have an actual conversation. And that's always fun. Hi, everybody. 24 hours later, Dr. Dan here. Just a quick update on what I just said about a potential conversation with Dr. Hunter. So as of that recording that you just saw, I would have put it at 50-50 maybe, that we were going to set something up and he was going to come on my channel and we would talk, as I've done with lots of professional creationists in the past. Since then, that email conversation has continued, and he got really mad at me. I'm not exactly sure why. I tried to explain the Gemini virus thing, and using that as an example of how I think it's unreasonable to say that we don't even have an idea of how any single group of viruses evolved. And he got really mad and hostile about that. So the thing you just saw, I would have put it at about 50-50. 24 hours later, as I record this, I would put it at 90-10 against, and that's probably being generous to my chances at this point. So I don't think I'm going to end up having a conversation with Dr. Hunter on this channel, but who knows? Stranger things have happened. We'll see. Just wanted to give everybody that update and also, not get your hopes up. Back to what I had previously recorded. So thank you for watching, everybody. Before you go, please remember to hit the like button down below, leave a comment, share this video. If you are not already a channel member, please consider becoming a channel member. Support what I do here. It's just a hobby. But you do get immediate access to pre-recorded videos. You don't have to wait for the public release. Sometimes that means you get a video like a day ahead of time, and sometimes you get it like a week or two ahead of time. It depends on how on top of things I am at any given time. Thank you all again for watching. Don't get fooled.